Let me just welcome you and just say glad that you're here. It's good to see many of you. And as we are gathered tonight to learn and grow and discern together, let me allow us to begin with a word of prayer, if you'll pray with me. Living God, thank you for the gift of this night, for the opportunity to grow together, to learn together, and to take our next step closer to Christ. I pray that you would bless our time. May it be filled with your Spirit. May it be fruitful. And would you help us all to grow in fellowship with one another and in relationship with you. Thank you for the gift of technology that allows us to meet over Zoom. And we thank you for Dr. Bacote and his presence here with us tonight. And we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, tonight we are beginning a 4-part series called Pathways to a Better Christian Witness on Race. And I just want to frame this conversation to say that this is an important one, not only for our nation, our community, but for our church. I was looking back to how our broader church has been thinking about the issue of race, and more specifically the sin of racism. And 4 years ago, in 2016, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA approved anti-racism policy called Facing Racism, a Vision of Intercultural Community. And just an excerpt from that said this: "Racism is a lie about our fellow human beings, for it says that some are less than others. It is also a lie about God, for it falsely claims that God favors parts of creation over the entirety of creation. Because of our biblical understanding of who God is and what God intends for humanity, the PCUSA, the Presbyterian Church, must stand against, speak against, and work against racism. Anti-racist effort is not optional for Christians. It is an essential aspect of Christian discipleship, without which we fail to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ." So we as a congregation are all about proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. That is part of our mission. And to help us do that in a more effective and more informed way, tonight we are blessed to be joined by Dr. Vincent Bacote. And Dr. Bacote is an associate professor of theology, and the director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College. He's the author of several books, and he's a regular columnist for Comment Magazine, contributes to other publications like Christianity Today, and he is a thoughtful, humble Christian. It's been a privilege to get to know Dr. Bacote in preparation for this series. So, Dr. Bacote, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to put in the chat Dr. Bacote's website in case you want to look up more about him or check out some of his publications. But thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you and allow you to take it from here.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to do this. It's a privilege to be asked to do this, and I'm glad to enter into this conversation. It's not a new conversation, but we are at a moment when I think we can make strides on this issue that we've struggled to do as a country and as a world and as a church. Before beginning, I'm going to say something that I say every time or every time in recent years when I have talked about something related to race. And it's something that I want to invite you to do as I present about this. And this is what I'd invite you to do. I invite you to take the following posture. I invite you to take a tell me more posture rather than a yeah, but posture. And the reason that I want to say that is because a lot of times what happens in conversations about race, not only conversations about race, but certainly in conversations about race, when things start moving forward, uh, for varying reasons, some people at least, I think they are preparing themselves to respond to whatever it is that they're going to. And so much energy invested in the yeah, but, in other words, having an alternate explanation about everything, that what it does is it gets in the way of actually having conversation. And a tell me more posture is not a posture that says that you agree with everything someone says, but it's actually a posture that says, even if I disagree with you, I want to enter into conversation about this. I want us to talk together about this. I want us to move towards mutual understanding on this. And I think that's a much more constructive way, a much more Christian way to go about it. But a lot of times what happens is, for varying reasons, people have a posture where they're ready to just respond with already their own explanation and interpretation about whatever the topic is, in this case, the topic of race. And the thing is I think sometimes a yeah, but posture betrays the fact that people then respond as if they have omniscience about this topic. And of course, none of us has omniscience about everything, about anything, much less everything. And there's always more for us to learn about things. So I think if we can have a tell me more posture, even if you don't understand what I'm saying, you don't quite get it, you're like, why did you say this? Then we can have the conversation about, well, why did you say this? And tell me more about what that is. Or if you disagree with it, you can say, here's why I disagree with it, but let's talk more about this because maybe we agree about more than we recognize. So I think it's very important to take more of a tell me more posture than a yeah, but posture. And within the church itself, that alone, if the church was characterized by a tell me more posture than a yeah, but posture, then I think the reputation of Christianity, particularly white Christians in the United States of America and beyond, their reputation would be different on the question of race than it is. Because a lot of times it gets very politicized, it gets very personal, and people are kind of wound like a spring ready to uncoil at the end of hearing someone talk about these kinds of things. So I'd like us to move towards the kind of witness where we're telling me more people, even when we may not understand what's being said, or even if we don't agree with what is being said. So I'd like us to start with that. So I hope that's what one will be willing to do. In talking to Pastor Smith about this, one of the things that I thought would be helpful is to start with what your church already teaches, what your church already says about itself, rather than me providing a whole lot of content external to what your church already believes. Doesn't mean that there aren't things external to what the church believes that aren't worth learning about or knowing. But I think one of the things that I thought about a lot recently is that it's important to recognize that the things that Christians believe actually open up trajectories for us to live as people of faithfulness to God on all these types of questions. And a lot of times what doesn't happen is that we don't look to what we already believe, what we're already proclaiming, what we're already saying about our Christian community. If I'm looking to those things and asking how those things set the stage for us or orient us towards identifying what we're talking about and responding faithfully to those types of situations. So what I'm trying to do and what is in the description is about trying to talk about, well, what do you already believe at First Presbyterian? What do you already talk about at First Presbyterian? And how do those things actually orient you towards a way of thinking about and engaging the question of race? So tonight, I'm starting with a couple of the First Presbyterian Wheaton values. So if one goes to the website of First Presbyterian Wheaton, one sees that there are certain statements about what we value as a congregation. And there are two of those values that I like to talk about. And it's how we talk about those, I think, that can help us to begin thinking about engaging the question of race. So first value that I want to talk about is the one that's about abundant compassion. And so abundant compassion is great. And the Bible verse associated with abundant compassion is Matthew chapter 14, verse 14. And while it's entirely possible that everyone has Matthew 14:14 memorized, I'll read it anyway. So I'll read it. So it says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he saw a large crowd. That's why I emphasize that. Saw them, right? He had compassion on them and healed their sick. And so if we're going to be engaging the question of race, and we're going to be people of abundant compassion, if First Presbyterian Wheaton is going to be people of abundant compassion, if you're going to pursue a life of compassion, if you're going to exhibit compassion, then the first thing I want to point out in terms of what's there on the website is when you're quoting Matthew 14:14, you're talking about first the fact that Jesus sees the people, and in seeing them, there's things he recognizes about them, and then he acts with compassion. So I think one of the first things that we have to think about with the question of race is actually having eyes to see what is there. I think one of the things that often happens in engagements about the question of race is someone describes an event that happened to them, or they talk about how they grew up. My parents grew up in South Carolina, in the Jim Crow era. And they might say, I grew up in Jim Crow, but I still experience these kinds of Jim Crow things today, and I'll tell you exactly what happened, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so a person might say to them when they hear a story like that, an anecdote like that, they might say, well, I don't see it that way. So their response is to say to the other person, I know that you're telling me something about your experience, and I think I kind of understand the kind of thing that you are describing, and the kind of thing that you were describing, you think that it has something to do with racism in some way, whether that's racism in terms of what an individual does, or whether what happens in terms of a systematic type of way. And the response that I don't understand is often a response where a person is saying, they're not saying this explicitly, but what they're really saying is that they are not disposing themselves to see what the person is saying is there. They're disposing themselves to see however they already see the world and what goes on in the world, and whatever goes on in the world in relationship to questions of race. And I think that if we're going to have the kind of disposition that we see in Matthew chapter 14, and you're talking about being people of abundant compassion, to be a person of compassion, that means you're entering into the experiences of others, right? Compassion is, to have feeling with others. To respond to someone's narrative about, for example, being pulled over for driving while black, let's go with that one, or police harassment, or something that happens in the context of a job that seems to be racial discrimination, to respond by saying you don't see it that way, or by reinterpreting to someone else their experience according to your perspective, is not to try to feel what they're feeling. It's in fact actually to tell them what they ought to be feeling is what you're doing in a situation like that, right? When I always think about that, I always think, I wonder how that works in a marriage, right? Where someone says, I'll tell you what you're feeling. I mean, I know what you told me, what you said, but I'll tell you what it really is. I don't think that this is the most successful way for a marriage to move forward with that kind of communication. And the thing is, of course, often the questions are raised, of course, these are not questions within a marriage. These are questions in other relationships. And so sometimes people aren't as invested as they are in a marriage to do the work that's necessary for a marriage to work. They might be interested in doing what it takes for a marriage to work, but they're not as interested in doing the work that's necessary for these other relationships to work. And so then what happens is, right, you have this circumstance of dissonance. The circumstance of dissonance is an unwillingness to see what is there. And let's be clear about this. When it comes to the question of race, if someone tells you about something that they thought was an incident of racism, it's entirely possible you may not understand what they're talking about. But if we're going to be people who are seeing what is there, so that we have compassion like Jesus did, seeing the distress of the crowd, so seeing the distress of someone who is talking about their experience of racism, then if I don't understand it, my response in order to see is to do what's necessary so that I'm able to see. So, just to use as an example, I'm wearing glasses. So, my glasses have a particular prescription. Something has to happen to my lenses in order for me to be able to actually see what is there. So similarly, in this type of situation, if you don't see what is going on when someone is describing these types of things, the question ought to be, well, maybe I have a problem with my prescription. Maybe I need my prescription to be modified so I am now able to see what is there when I did not beforehand see what is there. One of the interesting things about the current circumstance post the death of George Floyd is that I mean, now you had the Ahmaud Arbery situation, and then you had the situation with the lady in Central Park. So I think those things got people's attention. But I think the thing about the George Floyd circumstance was that, you know, it was on camera, and if you watch the whole thing, I mean, before that he got, Chauvin got him on the ground, etc. I mean, this is much longer than 8 minutes. So you're kind of seeing this relationship going on with the police, etc. And irrespective of whether George Floyd, was acting in a way that seemed hostile or whatever, I mean, all those types of things are fine to talk about. The fact is that people saw him get put on the ground. They saw Chauvin put his knee on his neck and just stay there, right? And he stayed there for almost 8 minutes. And people who bothered to watch the video that long. Now, I've seen enough things like that. I don't need to watch 8 minutes of that. But other people did. A lot of people did. And I think for a lot of people, seeing that, and perhaps particularly, citizens are saying to Chauvin, what are you doing, etc. Chauvin looks at the camera like, what are you going to do? Right? I think people seeing that, for some people, I think for all of a sudden, what people have been saying for decades, if not longer, people now say, oh my God, it's real. And something happens that changes their lens, changes their prescription, and they're beginning to see what is there. And so I think it's important for us, if we're going to be people of abundant compassion, is to be people who are willing to see. And then if you have a willingness to see, you are also having a commitment to understand what is going on. Now, when it comes to having a commitment to understanding what is going on, here's something that you must know. Depending upon who you talk to, depending upon who you read, if you ask someone to define what racism is, depending on which people you read, you're going to get different nuances of that. So I would recommend based on, what Pastor Smith began, how is it already described by your denomination when they're talking about anti-racism? How are they describing that? Right? The lie about human beings, the lie about God. I think that's one place to start. Another place to start is to think about racism as a species of the violation of the first and second greatest commandments, right? So, because the way that it works is people actually, when they elevate themselves over someone else, they regard their kind of people as being people who are essentially, they kind of have like a godlike, a commitment like to a god, to their ethnicity or to their race. And there's them, and then there's everybody else. So you have that part. And on top of that, have the antithesis or an opposition or an antagonism toward neighbors. And it's an antagonism that is, at least in terms of within one's mind, regarding others as less than you on the basis of race, and at most finding ways to create realities all the way to the structuring of societies to, if not oppressing people, all the way to pretty much trying to destroy them. I mean, this is, and it's based on the concept of they are not the race that I am. And because of what they are, because of what I am, I'm superior. They need to be at least, in their place, at most gone. Okay, that's basically what racism is. So I think that's one way to think about it. Some of you have probably heard people say, well, aren't people, just by being white people in the United States of America, doesn't that just sort of make you a racist? Well, I think you really have to sit for a long conversation with someone about that to understand what they mean, if that's what they're saying. It's a very particular way of understanding how people inhabit life in the modern West. Of course, the modern West was constructed by who? By Europeans. And the Europeans who constructed the modern West, I don't think that they constructed it for everyone to be equal. In fact, they didn't even construct it for all Europeans to be equal. Ask the Irish about that. Ask some people in the north of Scotland about that. They'll tell you some stories. And other Europeans will as well. So the point being that the modern West, though, suggests something about everyone being equal and rational, etc. That's never what was believed. And that was never really what was put into practice. And the point is that we're in the wake of a world created by Europeans, and that world created by Europeans, part of what came with it was this modern idea of race, where you categorize people white or Caucasian, black or Negro, etc., and others. And what came along with that was building a world that is better for some Europeans and not so good for others. So that's part of the world that we inhabit. And for some people, when they talk about that being the way that the world was structured, they're saying, well, just by being on the right team, you're kind of racist, just because you're on that team, no matter what you thought. And of course, if people hear that, some people say, how can you say that? I've never treated anybody that way. I was always taught to treat people nice, et cetera, et cetera. That's entirely fine. I mean, I think that may be completely true of you. For a person who's thinking about it in that way, the way that I just described, they're not thinking about about the sentiments of you as a person. They're thinking about the fact that you're implicated in the construction of a world that was built for Europeans. That's what they're talking about, basically. Now, I'm not saying that you need to even agree with that view of racism. I just want you to understand that when some people talk about, okay, if you're white and in the West, well, you're racist whether you recognize it or not. Well, all I would say is make sure you understand exactly what people mean when they say that. Because a lot of times people wind up with all kinds of rabbit trails, people get upset, etc., when that happens, and you don't get anything constructive. So if you're going to be the people that are pursuing and exhibiting compassion at First Presbyterian, What you need to do in a situation like that is you need to say, tell me more, because I really do not understand what you mean. But also do your best not to take that personally. Now, you're right saying, they just said I was a racist. How am I supposed to not take that personally? Well, what I mean is this. When you're trying to understand what's going on, find out what they mean. Now, some people, when they're saying that, you need to understand that they're just really kind of upset. They're kind of bent, actually, right? Or they're like a pressure cooker that's been, closed for a long time. The pressure's been building, and they're about to blow, or when they're blowing, this is what's going on. And in that situation, again, just try to be the one that seeks to understand. Say, I understand the theory that they're going with, but I think it winds up not doing justice to, the actual sentiments of individual persons. So at least be willing to do that in a circumstance with that. So if you're going to pursue and exhibit compassion, see what's there, be committed to understanding what's going on with the whole question of racism, which includes understanding the fact that people will talk about this sometimes in differing ways. And at the very least, I would say understanding that if you understand how the construction of the modern idea of race comes along with the construction of the world that we call the modern world, the Enlightenment world, then it's always been in place to be a world that had Europeans on top. And that's just the way that it is, right? And by the way, certain Europeans on top, because the Irish would say they were not talking about us, at least the Irish, if no one else. So the point is, okay, that at least try to understand that this is how it has come to us, and that there are particular ways that has been put into practice. And unfortunately, part of what has happened in the way this has been put into practice in the modern world is that a lot of Christian traditions, and there's a book by a guy named Robert P. Jones called White Too Long that just came out where he says this: mainline Christians, evangelical Christians, and Roman Catholics, all of them basically kept in place a world where it served the way they practice the faith is that it served a presumption of racial hierarchy, with whites on top and then everybody else not being beneath whites. So that doesn't mean every Christian thought that, but there were a lot of Christians that, whether they were trying to be intentional and mean about it, or whether they were just kind of going with the flow, it's what they did. So I think it's important to keep to be aware that this is part of the world that we have, right? So that may be a lot of work to learn some of the details of all of that, but at the very least, think about it as a violation of love of God and love of neighbor, and look at what your denomination has already said. All right, very briefly on the last one, and then I'll stop. And that is, the second value is intentional growth. And the text for intentional growth is Romans 12:2. Right? Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may test and approve or to discern what God's will is, that which is good, pleasing, and perfect. Now, and the point here, I would say, is if you're seeking intentional growth and resisting conformity, one of the questions that you have to ask yourself when you're dealing with the question of race is asking, is it possible that there are ways that I've been conformed to the ways of the world, and part of the ways of the world ever since the fall has basically been that human beings, ever since Adam said to God, "The woman you gave me," ever since then, humans have had problems with each other and have tried to dominate each other. And that racism is a particular species that's been very successful, and like a virus that mutates and it's very, like very, very, if viruses can be savvy, it's savvy. The race is like that, and it's something that has operated in a way for some humans to be dominant over others. And the point being that if you're thinking about not being conformed to the pattern of this world, and part of the pattern of this world is that humans have tried to be dominant in various ways, and racism is one of those ways, everyone needs to ask themselves, no matter what your ethnic background is, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to see how maybe I've been conformed to the pattern of this world when it comes to this? I have to be willing to ask myself that question. I think something that often happens is that people will pray prayers about, Lord, search my heart, Lord, open my mind, my expose. And what they mean is actually expose certain things. Other things are off limits. Other things are not subject for conversation because I think I got that one in the bag, right? And really, if we are people who are really letting God be the ones that shines the light on our hearts, then we have to be willing to ask God to show us, might there be some conformity that I really don't want to find out about? Might there be some conformity going on here that if I discover it, it's like, oh. In fact, you know what it's like? It's like once I remember I was reading about something, one of the commandments, I think it was, and I felt like God was sort of like, in the spirit was sort of like saying to me, I think you have a problem with that. And what I kind of thought to myself was, well, surely not I, Lord. And of course, the response was, oh, yes, you, right? Because you're the one reading this. Nobody else is reading this. You're the one reading this. And I'm telling you, you need to pay attention to this because perhaps you were not. And the point is that we always have to be willing to have those moments where we would rather not be exposed about what is a problem, about something where we are conforming to the pattern of this world. When it comes to race, everyone needs to be asking, are there ways in this society that, in a book called Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, they talk about the fact that we are in a racialized society, is the term that they like to use. That in this racialized society, there's just a cultural formation that has happened that puts in place ways that people just think, well, this is just kind of the way things are supposed to be, right? If you I think it's on the website, but if you look me up elsewhere, you'll discover that I went to college in Charleston, South Carolina at the Citadel, the military college of South Carolina. And in fact, I'm going to tilt this back. If you look at that hat up there, okay, that's my Shako from when I was an officer, when I was a senior. You got to do something with that hat after you graduate, right? So now it's basically scenery. It's like some furnishing in my office is basically what it is. But the Citadel is an institution where one of the things that you learn, the first thing you learn as a freshman is that the first shots of the Civil War were fired by 2 Citadel cadets. My point is that Confederate heritage is part of the place, is part of the history of the place where I went to college. Now, I'm an unapologetic graduate of the Citadel. It's a great school, etc. But part of the challenges of the imperfections of the Citadel is knowing how to be completely honest about that history and how you can say good things about people from the South, but also acknowledge that there's problems with the fact that at least part of the cause of the Confederacy was fighting to keep slavery in place. And so, there are people in the South who still believe, and by the way, this is not just the South, it's just obvious in certain ways in the South. They believe that the way the world's supposed to operate is that Southern white males are supposed to be on top, and then there's everybody else, right? And of course, it's not just in the South where that happens. You can go to Oregon. Oregon has a history that is intentionally racist. If any of you remember in the 1970s, what happened when they began to do busing integration in Boston? Okay, Boston's supposed to be like liberal and progressive. Well, they weren't so liberal and progressive when it came to busing. Okay, they were very hostile when it came to talking about, you know, that kind of equality. Point is that there's all kinds of ways people are conformed to this world around the question of race and racial hierarchy. And everyone needs to be willing to ask that question. So if you're going to seek intentional growth, one of the ways to do that is to be willing to ask, what's here? What's here? What are my reflexive ways of looking at the world? How have I learned to regard others? And by others, I mean those who are not like me. Now, it can be, for some people, that's like, if you're not my family, you're other in certain ways, right? But sometimes it's others because they are my ethnicity, are my race. And so I've learned, perhaps without ever being told anything, that, well, we're on top, they're definitely not. We're the people that are supposed to be successful, they're supposed to be servants, et cetera, et cetera. And so one has to be willing to ask, have there been ways when I've been, if you will, formed by the culture, discipled by the culture, to just have assumptions about racial hierarchy? It's a question everyone needs to be willing to ask. And of course, part of what goes on with intentional growth is, am I willing to seek God's will? Yeah, the second half of Romans 12:2, that which is good, pleasing, and perfect. And in doing that, is my pursuit of this seeking what it means to really model life together with people who aren't like me racially? And here's the hard part about this. Life together does not mean that when somebody who's not like me is part of my community, they always know that they are a visitor. And they never feel like this is their home. They never feel like that they are a contributor. Because a lot of times people intend to make steps towards reconciliation or integration, etc. But it always winds up being that one, sometimes, not always, sometimes it winds up being situations where the people that are inviting someone into something, they're the ones that must always control everything. They never invite the person to actually be a contributor. It's like you can be present, but you cannot really be a contributor except according to the specifications I give you for being a contributor. So it's not really making someone part of the family. It's keeping someone perpetually a visitor. What does it mean to be a place, to be a community, to be people who are really making themselves and their communities home for others? And when it's home for others, that means their gifts, their talents, their abilities, their histories, their insights, those contributions are welcomed, not just because they're neat, but because they're necessary. They're vital. And it's part of what it means to live together. And it's often going to be living together differently than what people are used to. And being willing to do that is a big part, I think, of moving forward. All right, it's 7:41. And I sort of got to what I had on this piece of paper here. But hey, we've got 3 more weeks. So it's time for all kinds of other stuff. So I'll stop. And I'll hand it back to Pastor Smith and let him run the Q&A, and then I'll answer your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bacote. Let me just say that if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself and ask it. And we have about 20 minutes for questions for Q&A here. Let me begin by asking you a question while we allow others to contemplate one if they have one. But you said early on, and I love the way that you frame this tell me more posture versus a yeah, but posture. Such a great visual and application. And you said early on that the reputation of Christians, particularly white Christians, would be different, maybe would be better on the issue of race if we had that yeah but posture. Can you think of any specific examples or expressions of what things could look like when we do have that posture, or how practically things can look better for us in our witness, in our proclamation of faith, and in just doing life together and doing it better in community with different races?
Sure. I think one of the ways it would look different, and some people are doing this. Okay, so I don't want to say like nobody's doing this. Okay, so I see a recording button up there. So for the recording, for posterity. Okay, some people do these things. Okay, not everyone is a yeah but person. Some people are. Tell me more people. So I want to acknowledge this, but that is not my that's perspective of how across the liberal to conservative spectrum in terms of Christianity. And I think that what it would look like, one example is, and this goes back to the pursuing and exhibiting compassion thing. So if we're going to have abundant compassion, it would be not having what I call selective empathy. And what I mean by that is, people are willing to feel bad or with you about certain things, but not others, because they're just not really sure they really believe you. I'll give you an example. So Jacob Blake was shot in the back 7 times, and it's entirely possible that somebody watching that might say, "Well, why was he walking away from the cops to begin with?" And so when someone says that, it's a kind of, sometimes people use the phrase these days, whataboutism. In other words, they basically say, well, if he hadn't been doing that, he never would have got shot. Well, it's very interesting that disproportionately you have greater aggression towards minorities than you do towards whites from the police. Even though, the numbers are not going to be the same, because you have fewer minorities in the country than you do in the majority. But the point I'm making here is that if someone is watching that and somebody goes, "Wow," again, and somebody's telling you about that, if your response is, "Well, but it seemed like he was resisting arrest," which sounds like that the person basically, you basically have to make a case that to actually care about whether the policeman did his job well or not, or was yet another black man getting shot by the cops, etc., that you have to go through this entire process of proving that the person didn't deserve to get shot. And once you prove that they deserve to not get shot, then maybe you can talk about the fact that it was distressing. And I think for a lot of people, they feel like, if you talk about Michael Brown when he was shot, it's entirely possible that Michael Brown was grabbing Darren Wilson's gun, et cetera, et cetera. None of that explains why his body laid out in the street as long as it did, and all these other things that happened. And the point is that some people might say, well, if Michael Brown had been a better person, then he never would have been shot. I don't think he didn't really say hands up, don't shoot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what a person does when somebody's responding to what's going on with Michael Brown is that what a person's receiving, a minority person is receiving, is you're not actually asking me why I feel, why is this bothering me the way that it does? Because please understand, in minority communities, especially high crime minority communities, they care a lot. They don't like high crime being there. They're just very distressed about that. They just don't take those conversations out into the public, right? Because taking it out in the public is like ammunition for people that already think less, of those communities. So I think in a situation like that, somebody's saying, "Wow, that really bothers you. Tell me more." what I mean, or someone says again, and then the response is, well, we got to take these things on a case by case basis because all these people, weren't innocent people, and because they weren't innocent people, again, the way this is interpreted by some people, you're saying they weren't innocent, therefore they deserve to get publicly executed. Is the way that some people feel about that. And so I think, irrespective of how you might evaluate the merits of the case in terms of police work and the law, etc., one of the things to do is to actually find out how's the person doing because this has landed with them a certain way. Right? That doesn't mean you might eventually get to the whole question about adjudicating the case. That's fine, but what they're telling you is that it's another thing. It's like having lots of paper cuts, and here's another one. Just because they're seeing that, right? And it's the fact of seeing that's, and where Jacob Blake got shot. Oh, I'm just so tired of this. I'm so distressed by this. And so even if you think I've got questions about why he's walking away from the police, which is a valid question, that's not the point. That's not the thing to talk about in that moment. The thing in that moment is to enter into what somebody's experiencing. Oh wow, what's happening? Tell me what you're feeling. How are you seeing this? Right? And because chances are what you're going to discover is that what they're talking about isn't actually just Jacob Blake or Michael Brown. It's really the accumulation of a lot of things. And actually taking the time to find out where they are, how they've been feeling, how distressed they are, in some cases, how nervous they are. Because what's going to happen if I get pulled over by a cop? All these kinds of questions. Directing to the people those types of empathetic responses, I think, would be one way that if that was characteristic, people would say, well, even if they didn't completely understand what was happening legally, they made sure that people knew that they were heard. And that people cared about what they were feeling. Because a lot of times it's a lot of things that people are feeling. But when the response is, well, let's evaluate all this before we care about it, I think that people get that experience over and over again, then they get really mad. So some get really mad, some just stay quiet, never say anything. As with all kinds of people, some people are going to get loud, some people are going to get quiet, and some people in between. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question. I see in the chat, Charles says, it's nice to be talking about systemic racism. Actually, I was really talking about interpersonal empathy with the relationship with the person who sees Jacob Blake or whatever, and then they are they're really more upset that they are being personally disregarded, and that people aren't believing what they say or feel about racism. Now, in the conversation as it goes on, is likely that a person will begin to talk about a racist society or a racist police force or a racist system, something like that. That you might eventually get there for sure. But in terms of what I was specifically talking about, it was really about that relationship. But to going over the question of systemic racism, Philip asks, do you find that Wheaton College has the same level of systemic racism as U.S. society? Are Christians different than non-Christians regarding systemic racism? So on question number one, I've been at Wheaton 21 years. And what I would say is I think Wheaton's better than it was. But as I've said in many places, and we'll say in many others, we'll say tonight, better is not like arriving at the kingdom of God. Better means, oh, well, we finally hired someone that's a diversity officer who's really good at what they do. But in a way, with the student body, it's like every 4 years, you just kind of wash, rinse, and repeat. Because students come from all kinds of places, and sometimes just simply because people haven't been around a lot of minorities that come from predominantly white communities, and the great majority of Wheaton College students are white, they just don't know what to think or understand what they might be bringing with them. And so you're engaging a lot of the same conversations all the time. I mean, and I get the thing about systemic racism, I would say, is, in my view, systemic racism is what happens in terms of policies, what happens in terms of the things in place through the institutions of society, or through the effect of people who are in places of influence in institutions, and because of what they do, that may have or unspoken racism that they just do without thinking about it. That's another way that it can be put in place without a person perhaps intending to do that. I mean, I don't think that we are an institution that is like the worst about this, but there's just always room to grow, because Wheaton College is primarily a white Midwestern evangelical institution. And because you're a white Midwestern evangelical institution, there's a lot that people just don't know, that to be a white evangelical Midwestern institution is to not know sometimes that when people who aren't white Midwestern evangelical show up, that you don't treat people like they're strange because they're not that. Or you don't tell them that because they might emphasize certain things in the Bible differently from you do, that those things don't really count, or those things aren't as important. So I think there's more. I would say it's more about enculturation to me than systemic racism per se. Are Christians not different than non-Christians regarding systemic racism? It depends. Ironically, in Robert P. Jones's "White Too Long," the people that were harder to get to actually address race in some ways were the Christians, whether they were white, whether they were Protestant, liberal Protestant, conservative Protestant, or Catholic. The non-Christians in some ways were more willing to move in certain ways on that. And his argument would be because people are in traditions that have been vested in kind of using, Jesus to keep those things in place. So I think in some ways, unintentionally, I think Christians do it. So, but I guess what I would also say, though, the flip side of it is that Christians have the potential to be the people that do the most good about this. And Christians are the ones who are told to worship God alone. Don't worship any person, any characteristic of a person. Don't worship, a nation. Don't worship a thing, etc. And to seek the good of all people. I mean, to be characterized by love. And to the extent that Christians are genuinely doing that and living out its fullest expression, the Christians are the people that in every area of life, I think, can make a difference about that. And in the ways that racism has operated in those areas of life, they're the ones that have the greatest potential to do the most to bring good in those areas. But there has to be the willingness to do that. And one of the biggest challenges is seeing that racism is not just about personal prejudice, but that it is about that can operate at a corporate or structural level. And I think one of the things that people might say is, well, these laws were passed, et cetera. To which my response is, people who built companies and built society well before 1965, their influence remains in a lot of things. And so whether laws were passed, okay, the legacy of those things are living legacies, right? one great example is that, and some of you may know this, is that, when the suburbs emerged post-World War II, the government says, right into the ways that you are talking about who can be there, that you will not sell to Negroes. And that the people who buy those agree, if they move somewhere, not to sell to Negroes. And the point is, of course, how do you get a lot of the wealth and the building of a middle class? Well, you get that through real estate, is what you get it through. And you are intentionally antagonizing wealth creation of minorities. And so when you do that, and you finally begin, after 20 or 30 years, to begin to work against redlining, et cetera, middle-class African Americans might begin to enter into some of that. But a lot of people who are in poor neighborhoods who couldn't move out, they're still basically in the same kind of circumstances that they were economically prior to like 1964 and 65. So all I'd say is that the legacy of what happens with those things remains. And passing a law is not violation. Lyndon Johnson signed some things, everybody changes. That would be magnificent, right? But this is not what has happened. Nor is what has happened is there is no evidence that I've seen of any Christian tradition where you've had predominantly white Christians saying, wow, we just experienced this major revival around the question of race. Hasn't happened. I mean, I'm happy to be informed about one having happened if anyone wants to tell me, but I have not read about this anywhere. And the point is that that hasn't happened. None of us should be surprised that there's like, that this is like an anchor. Okay, that is, that is like, or if you're at sea, it's like an anchor. If you're on land, it's like an anvil, and it's chained to your leg, and you're trying to move forward with an anvil chained to your leg. You're not going to go very far. So I think that's still where we are. That's it. Now, notice, I didn't say we haven't gone anywhere. We have. I teach at Wheaton College, and a bunch of white people are listening to me talk, and I'm not getting about a bunch of whataboutism, and I think most of you actually believe that I earned my PhD. You don't think because I'm African American, there's no way that Negro could have earned that PhD. I don't think any of you are thinking anything about that. So, that, I mean, there's a lot that's changed. So I don't feel like people, that I have to go prove myself in my class. Okay, I need to make sure that they really believe that I'm like, that I deserve to work at Wheaton College and that I haven't been doing this with smoke and mirrors for 21 years, etc. I don't feel like that at all. I mean, that's a major thing because I'm in a department that in 1957, a man named David Scholler, who used to teach at Fuller Seminary, he died a few years ago. He asked people in my department about whether someone of my pigmentation could be teaching the department. And he was told by a professor in my department, which I now teach, he was told, they don't have it in them, is what he was told. And so my point is that I'm in this department and Esau College is in this department, okay? And no one's acting like, I don't really think you guys really can cut it at Wheaton College, Esau's doing great, and I've had a really good experience with Wheaton. So there's definitely been progress, but progress is not a rival.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Bacote. We're just about at the end of our time, but does anyone have a burning question that they would like to ask here as we're at the very end? Did anyone have anything they wanted to ask Dr. Bacote? Of course, we'll be picking this up again next week. But did anyone want to add anything or ask a final question? Well, an hour flies by. As you and I were talking, Dr. Bacote, things can always fill the time, and we can get going on topics. But I know that probably all of us have been challenged tonight. We've learned something. We've been encouraged. We've been made uncomfortable. in a holy kind of way. So let me just thank you for being with us again tonight. And do you want to mention any comments ahead of next week? Anything to be thinking of? Any closing thoughts, I guess, prior to us gathering again next week?
I would say if there's a question that you were going to ask, to write it down. Or if a question comes up, to write it down so that you have it in hand for next week. And I'm still discerning which thing from the beliefs. There's like a lot of different things to choose from, so I haven't decided which move I'm going to make for next week, because I want to do this out of what out of the documents and beliefs that you already have. So and so talking about abundant compassion and intentional growth, I think was for me. I saw that, I thought that's a good place to start, because your landing page, it's right there. So if this is who, so if someone says, hey, what kind of people are First Presbyterian? Among the kind of things we're people who are seeking to be people of abundant compassion and intentional growth. Okay, if that's true of you, what does that mean when we're talking about race? So I think that's how I want to start. I have to choose which ones to go with. And of course, even over 4 weeks, some things are going to get left out. But yeah, but I haven't decided yet.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Dr. Bacote. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this important conversation. May God bless you. And we look forward to seeing you on Sunday, either at our outdoor worship at 8:30 or our live stream worship at 10 o'clock. And I look forward to picking this up again next week. Thank you all so much.
It's great to be with you all. Good to see you, Steve.